We get started.
Very good.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. The structure of this event will first be an introduction and a talk and presentation from author Richard Webb Jr. And lastly, we'll have some time to answer any questions and take comments. If you have any technical difficulties, feel free to type in your concern in the messenger box. And to ask a question or make a comment, feel free to type it in the messenger box there on the right, or in that Q&A box you see down below. Either way, I'll monitor them and we can address your comments or questions at the appropriate time. Richard Webb is an author, an award-winning educator, and a documentary filmmaker. A graduate of Vanderbilt University, he has taught history for 24 years at both the high school and college levels. A featured presenter in the Connecticut Public Broadcasting Prohibition documentary, Connecticut Goes Dry. Webb is also co-creator and co-producer with Robert Williams of a documentary film about the Fitzgeralds in Connecticut, Gatsby in Connecticut, which is a companion to the book Boats Against the Current. Please welcome Richard Webb.
Hi, Jessica. Thank you. Thank you to the Santa Fe Library. As I was telling Jessica and Maria, I'm especially excited to do this. This is my first of many Western Zoom appearances. I'm on a virtual book tour because of COVID. So I'm in the midst of 41 webinars, and I just want to thank you for joining me. At this point, I think the term Zoom out has a whole new meaning. So I appreciate you guys waddling through yet another Zoom. What I'm going to do is I'm going to be a talking head for just a little while. Then I'm going to start sharing you some images and one film clip. And then I'll return at the end as a talking head, and we'll be happy to take any questions. Before I start, I thought as a historian, it would be neat to talk about what was happening 100 years ago when the Fitzgeralds were in Connecticut. There were three crises that they faced and the country faced at that time. One was a pandemic, in which the only protection was masks. That was the influenza epidemic that killed 50 million people worldwide. Number two was the biggest race riots in American history since the Civil War, the greatest number of mass lynchings since the Civil War. 37 American cities erupted into racial violence. And the third thing was that the economy had absolutely tanked as the US economy adjusted after World War I. The Depression was so bad that at the time it was known as the Great Depression. So in the old history repeats itself category, there we are. Let me tell you really quickly about myself. I grew up a quarter of a mile away from where the Fitzgeralds honeymooned in the summer of 1920. And as a kid, I rode my bike around, as many kids do, and I knew the neighborhood like the back of my hand. And when I was 14, I read his second book, The Beautiful and Damned. It's his least read book, which is a reason enough to read it, isn't it? And I began to recognize as I read it, the geography of Westport. I mean, it was uncanny. Characters would take a left here, characters would take a right here. They'd go in a car to an area here and come back. And I was struck by, literally, I was reading a road map of Westport. I thought I had made a big discovery until I realized when they invented something called the internet, that indeed was the case. That Fitzgerald had written The Beautiful and Damned while he was in Westport, and it was completely autobiographical. And as I say that, I would like to give you the quote that Scott said himself. He said, "All my characters are F. Scott Fitzgerald." He wrote from his life, he plagiarized his own life fairly relentlessly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through two of his books. I'm going to start off with The Beautiful and Damned as a setup of how Westport was influenced his fiction. And then I'll get to what many of you are probably here to see, which is the connections to the Great Gatsby. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a screen. Okay, and yep, it looks like you guys are seeing this. So first we have to start with a shameless plug, and that's my book. Sorry about that, but there it is. That's Scott and Zelda in front of the Westport cottage that I grew up a quarter of a mile away from. What's interesting about that photo is that they came back 4 years after living in Westport for this photo shoot for an essay he had written that was in Motoring magazine called The Cruise of the Rolling Junk. So 1 year before Gatsby's published, they're back in Westport. And what I like to think about is that what they're doing is that they are reorienting themselves to the geography of Westport, which shows up so spectacularly in Gatsby. The reason I titled it Boats Against the Current was that that's in the last sentence of The Great Gatsby, but it was also indicative of my journey to prove that Westport was significant in Fitzgerald and Scott's, and Zelda's work as well. When I set out on this mission to try to prove that Westport was important, a leading Fitzgerald historian said, Deej, which is my nickname, Deej, if you get Westport in the top 25 of places that were important to the Fitzgeralds, it's a noble cause and it's a completely doomed cause. But what I did was, these are the 6 works, more than 6 works that Westport showed up in, because what I actually just did was I read everything that they had ever written. I read everything that was written about them. And all of a sudden, as if invisible ink were showing up between the printed lines of these biographies and their works, there was Westport everywhere. And what I'm glad to say I proved was that Westport, Connecticut was actually the place they wrote about the most, and was the most influential single place that they ever lived that showed up in both of their works. Many of you will know that Great Neck, Long Island gets a lot of credit. It's gotten the only credit for the Great Gatsby and its setting. And indeed, it is influenced by Great Neck. I like to say that Great Neck and Westport are a beach blend for the setting of the Great Gatsby. I'm also going to share with you that the head of the Great Neck Historical Society, after seeing my documentary, she said, Deej, Great Neck concedes to Westport as the setting for the Great Gatsby. And just to kind of set you up for what you're about to see, the leading Fitzgerald academic of our current day has said that this is the most significant finding in the last half century of Fitzgerald scholarship. So Westport's in The Beautiful and Damned, it's in The Great Gatsby, it's in Zelda's only novel, Save Me the Waltz, which is a completely biographical account of their time in Westport. It's in her play Scandalabra. It's in 5 of Scott's short stories, and it's in his essay, The Cruise of the Rolling Junk. I want to start off with this photo. They're married in 1920 in April. They spent about 5 weeks in New York City until they're literally kicked out of New York City. Think of that. That's quite the accomplishment. They stayed in the Biltmore and the Commodore Hotel. They were thrown out of both for lewd and lascivious behavior. My favorite story is that they were thrown out of one of those because they spent 30 minutes spinning in a brand new invention, which was called the revolving door, which meant that people could not come in and they could not go out of the hotel, so they got kicked out for that. Literally, they bought a secondhand car. They fled the city. They were on their way to Lake Champlain in Vermont. On the way, Scott found out that Lake Champlain was a very cold place to swim. And as he wrote Ruth Sturtevant, his childhood friend, he said, if Zelda can't swim, she's miserable So they had to find a warmer place to swim. And what they literally did was they took a right off the post road and they ended up in Westport, Connecticut. He wrote half of this book here, and half of the book itself takes place in the fictionalized Westport town of Marietta. One of my favorite stories about the cover of this book was that Scott said, you know, the artist did a pretty good job with Zelda. You know, that's pretty good, looks like her, but that's a pretty debauched version of myself. So I love that. This book is a completely fictionalized account of reality. It's about a young couple being married and going on a honeymoon and struggling through the issues of marriage, which is exactly what they were doing in Westport. And that's exactly what she wrote about in Save Me the Waltz. I'm going to go through this segment about his second novel, The Beautiful and Damned, rather quickly. And just wanted to point out a few things. I'll give you a second to read this passage from The Beautiful and Damned. Okay, that's the gray house. That's today. It was owned by the Gray family, an old pre-colonial family. It was colored gray during Scott and Zelda's time there, and it's colored gray to this day. And I love the description of it right there. What Scott's describing is the house. It's still there looking exactly like that. It is probably the best example of any single place that the Fitzgeralds ever lived that's intact. And if you're ever in Westport, I lead tours of Westport, and I can show you areas that, scenes that happen in The Beautiful and Damned, and scenes that happen in The Great Gatsby. But here he is just perfectly describing the house as a pre-revolutionary house. And that side porch on the left is just like it was back then. The only thing they've added on to is that porch on the right. And what I'm going to now show you is a sequence from a scene that happened actually to Scott and Zelda, that Scott then fictionalized, that happened to Gloria and Anthony. So when I talk about Zelda, I want you to think about Gloria Patch. When I talk about Gloria Patch, I want you to think about Zelda because they're the same. When I talk about Anthony Patch, I want you to think about Scott and Anthony Patch because they are the same. Don't worry about this. It's difficult to see as a presentation. I'm just going to give you a quick overview, and I hope you can grasp it. But what happened was that during one party that the Fitzgeralds had, there was a lot of drinking, and one of Scott's friends began to hit on Zelda pretty terribly. And she fled upstairs into their bedroom, only to be followed by this lunk. And after that, she ran out of the house to the train station in Westport, boarded a train, and fled Westport, being followed by Scott. Scott wrote about this. That's the exact same thing that Gloria does in the novel. That's the exact same thing that Anthony does in the novel. And just quickly, I'm going to show you, because I plotted this out on many of my bicycle and walking journeys. She runs out of the Fitzgerald house here. She's going to take a left here. She's going to take a right here. She's going to take a left here, and she's going to go to the train station. The reason I'm showing you this is because literally, step by step, you can follow this, and it's absolutely extraordinary. As Walter Robichuk said, there's probably no single step-by-step geography that you can follow in a fictional novel that's real ever written. So she runs out of the house in this party, and she starts down the front path towards the road, and there it is. If you go about a half a mile up the house, there's a barn there. It's still there today. It's now a converted house. And indeed, in the summer of 1920, this was the only place between the Fitzgerald house and the town of Westport. On a side note, it was interesting. My wife and I almost bought that house, but we found another one we were interested in. And there's my bicycle there. So just to show you, and that's the tour that I lead. So again, when I was reading the book, here it was, a quarter of a mile away from my house. I'm reading this book and I'm following in the steps of Scott and Zelda. Turns the fork, enters the wood. It was a wood back then. It's East Ferry Lane now. It's fairly wooded now, even to this day. She sees the road ahead of her. Again, Scott describes this. I'm giving you truncated versions that come from the book. And I'll give you a second to read this passage. Okay, keep in mind that The Beautiful and Damned is 5 years before The Great Gatsby. And what do you see right here? Scott is test driving the green light. The green light is the single most important symbol in all of The Great Gatsby. And arguably, it's the single most important symbol in American fiction in the 20th century. The green light representing the American dream. And here Scott is using it for the first time. As Charles Scribner, who is now an executive producer of our film, said that Charles Scribner was the grandson of the Scribner family that published Woolf, Hemingway, and Fitzgerald. He said that The Beautiful and Damned was his first try. The Great Gatsby was his second. So Scott plagiarized himself. And you know, that makes sense because it makes it easier to write, doesn't it? And just what I love is the visual imagery of him showing this, these towers, which still exist today, and using the description of them as a giant spider. Again, you just follow this route towards the train station, over this bridge. What I love is in The Beautiful and Damned, he talks about how the plank that you walk across over the bridge is 3 feet wide. And indeed, to this day, it's a yard wide. When you get halfway to that train bridge over the Saugatuck River in Westport, if you look, you'll see the town of Westport. Now, it's partly there, but it's obscured because of trees. It was deforested then, as Westport was a farming community. So you would have clearly seen the entire town back then when he wrote this. And again, she makes it to the train station. My favorite story is that they used to crawl onto the top of this station and wait for they'd be up all night long. Remember, she's 19 years old at this time. He's only 24. So they pulled all-nighters and they would wait for the first train to come that would go to New York City that came around 5:33 a.m. Okay. So what I'm going to do is, now that I've shown you that, give me a second. And I'm going to transition to the next PowerPoint, which is about The Great Gatsby. Okay, and again, shameless plug for the book. There they are. That's Anthony / Scott. That's Gloria / Zelda in front of their home. Again, they were there in the summer of 1920. They came back in 1924 for this photo shoot. And that's again a year before. This is for the essay, the photo essay, Cruise of the Rolling Junk. They were thus there just 1 year before Gatsby was published. And what I like to predicate is that once again, they were there to reorient themselves with the geography of Westport. So the question is, when I started this journey, this as a boat against the current, and was told that it was just fruitless to explore Westport as the setting for the Great Gatsby. One of the things I realized and why they both wrote about this time period, even though it was only 5 months, by the way, that was the average of where they stayed anywhere. They never owned a home, they always rented. And so for the 5 months that they were there, they were very, very happy. It was a tumultuous, but always loving relationship. The interesting thing is that Zelda, as I mentioned, was 19 then. And what's interesting to know is that within 10 years, she's already institutionalized for the first time at the tender age of 29. So, and then she's institutionalized off and on and mostly on for the rest of her life. So I like to think that she looked back on this time period with clarity, with joy, and with love. And that's why she wrote about it. And Scott began to spiral into a pretty desperate alcoholism quickly. He's dead 20 years after they lived here at the age of 44 through alcoholism. And so I like to think that both of them went back to this time period where their memories were fresh. I think in most, if not all marriages, the honeymoon is the best time period of it all. And especially maybe if the marriage ends in divorce. It's everybody's favorite time of their marriage. You're young, you're in love, and most of all, you can remember it with joy. Here they are, quick picture again. That's on their wedding day in April of 1920. 5 weeks later, they're in Westport, Connecticut. He's 24, she's 19, precocious. Really, America's first pop stars. They had, Scott not only had a literary, but with Zelda, a cultural fame that is something that we're all too used to today, but was novel at the time period. They are America's first pop stars, bar none. Okay, well, where do they move? They move into a small cottage on the corner of a gigantic 175-acre estate owned by a mystery millionaire. Now, if that's starting to ring some bells of memory with you, it should be. It's exactly as it is in the novel, where Nick Carraway lives on the corner of a massive estate. You'll notice that in all the films, Nick Carraway lives on the corner of a massive estate. What's interesting is when I went to Great Neck and began to poke around with my film partner, Robert Stephen Williams, we noticed they lived a couple of miles in the interior of Great Neck. They were not anywhere near the water. It was only in Westport where they were near the water, and it was only in Westport where they were on the corner of a mystery millionaire's estate. I'll be talking about him in just a second. Scott and Zelda would frequent this house of this mystery millionaire, F.E. Lewis. They spent a lot of time over here around this reflecting pool and in the back of the band shell. I'll be getting back to that later. And very soon I'll be talking about this absolutely extraordinary boathouse and tower complex here. This was all owned by this man, Frederick E. Lewis. 8 years ago, when I began my active research for this book, and my active research to look into something that I'd already by that point been pursuing for 40 years, this story, there was one thing about F.E. Lewis on the internet. He was being investigated for his holdings in a New York bank in 1907 during the Progressive era, when the government was starting to begin to investigate the excesses of capitalism with American corporations to see if they could tame them. And that was it. Now, because of my book and then the book, the film, there's a lot more on him. But here he is on the left. There he is at Longshore, the 175-acre estate in Westport, with 1 mile of shore, therefore the long shore. There he is on the right with the cowboy hat. That's significant. We'll be talking about why he's wearing a cowboy hat at the helm of one of his many boats. That's also significant. We'll be talking about that. And that's him in the middle. Who was he? Well, it took a lot of digging. The family categorically refused to talk to me, so it took even more digging. But I found out that he was the direct descendant for a guy named Moses Taylor, who, adjusted for inflation in today's money, is the 21st richest American in American history, according to Forbes magazine. And at the age of 21, Effie Lewis inherited, in today's money, $240 million. And it only grew from there. Here's his house, Longshore. It's still there today. I lead tours there, as I mentioned. It's completely intact. However, it has been altered. A lot of people look at this house and go, oh, it's big and it's a mansion. But a lot of people might say, well, Gatsby's mansion is much grander. Gatsby's mansion has that sort of, that velour of, and it is described in one part of Gatsby as a sort of like French chateau, Norman turreted mansion. But as Charles Scribner, again, a friend of mine now, the grandson of Charles Scribner, who published Hemingway, Wolfe, and Fitzgerald, said, he pointed out another part of The Great Gatsby where Nick describes it as that glorious ramshackle house. So it's interesting. It's described two ways. One, in this over-the-top sort of French royal chateau, and another one is a much more pedestrian sort of explanation. And Longshore, I think, fits the latter. Here's an aerial photograph of Longshore today. The core of the house is identical to when Lewis owned the house. This is what I like to call a nose job. That is now the Longshore Inn and Hotel, and there's a restaurant in the back of it. So that's just an aerial shot of what it looks like today. So it's still there. In Gatsby, Scott and Zelda, living on the corner of Lewis's estate, they used to take a shortcut through his estate to use his beaches. He had 3 of them. One of my favorite stories is that at one party, Zelda got very, very drunk, and Lewis forbade her from ever setting foot in this house again. However, he said, you can still continue to use my beach. And I'll tell you why I think he agreed to continue to do that a little bit later on in our story, and I think you'll agree with me. But sometimes what they did was that instead of taking the shortcut through his property and the reflecting pool and the band shell that I showed you earlier into the beach, what they would do is they'd walk down the road and take a right into his main entrance, which this is. Well, when you read Gatsby, it's right there. Nick says, instead of taking the shortcut through the Sound, we walked along the road and entered by the great posterns, and there they are. Again, a ludicrously incredible roadmap for the Great Gatsby. And just imagine myself growing up a quarter of a mile away from here, and all of a sudden realizing I am walking not only in the steps of Scott and Zelda, but I was walking in the steps of Nick Carraway and Daisy and Jay Gatsby. Just absolutely a remarkable story. And when I read The Beautiful and Damned, I said, okay, this is Westport. When I read Gatsby 2 years later as a sophomore in high school, I said to myself, well, could this be Westport too? But I couldn't really put it together. I kind of thought so, but I couldn't pin it. But I read Barbara Probst-Solomon's 1996 article called Westport Wildlife in the New Yorker. Barbara Probst-Solomon grew up across from the Fitzgerald estate. And in a brilliant essay, she argued that Westport was the setting of The Great Gatsby. And her article was crushed. The main Fitzgerald academic historian, Matthew Buckley, who I highly recommend. I read all of his stuff. He's the #1 Fitzgerald guy. The problem was that the idea that Westport was an influence on The Great Gatsby violated his own theory, and he tried to kill it. So what I did for many, many years is I went around to schools and high schools and colleges, showing PowerPoints, trying to defend Barbara's thesis. And eventually out of all of that came this book and the film, which I'll be showing you a clip from later. I showed you, this is a beautiful 1920s party picture. This is at Lewis's estate. Here's the reflecting pool that I showed you a little bit earlier. Here's the band shell that I showed you a little bit earlier. Here's a full piece jazz band. And you might remember You Gatsby Nuts. A great description of that fantastic jazz band at Gatsby's party. There you see the dancers, the jazz band, people having cocktails. This is Scott's first series of parties on the Northeast, coming from the Midwest as he did, just like Nick Carraway. And again, he incorporates these party scenes wholesale into Gatsby. F.E. Lewis was a champion horse person. So one of the things that Gatsby was he more than just was a guy who owned an estate in West Egg, East Egg. Remember West Egg, Westport? That's kind of a neat sort of connection. But he was a champion horseman. Here are that's his daughter, and a young man on the paths at Longshore. And what he did was that his fame and wealth preceded him before he even got to Westport. You see, he was a multi-millionaire, as I was telling you about. And what he did was he owned a colossal ranch in California. That's him on the right on one of his championship horses. What he did was he was one of the first two people to import the Arabian horse into America. They were not a popular breed before Lewis brought them in. Buffalo Bill Cody rode one of Lewis's own horses called Musan. Buffalo Bill Cody's horse, Musan, was his favorite horse in the Wild West shows that Buffalo Bill Cody engaged in around the turn of the century into the 20th century. And Lewis was a champion horse person. He was also a champion breeder of cattle and hogs. And he owned this giant 8,000-acre ranch. Keep in mind, this is before he comes to Westport. He owns it while he's in Westport. He travels there during the winters while he's in Westport. 8,000 acres in size, so large he had to build a halfway house on it because it took all day to just get halfway through it. You would spend the night and then you'd spend the next day seeing the rest of it. He called it Diamond Bar because his brand for his livestock was a diamond over a bar. And indeed, that is now the entire city of Diamond Bar, California. Alexis Morgan, the great soccer player, is from there. And Snoop Doggy Dogg, the great rapper, is from there too. here is the tower and the boathouse complex that was back in Westport at Longshore. The tower famously showing up in The Great Gatsby. In The Great Gatsby, Nick talks about Gatsby's guests diving from the tower of his raft. Well, there's the tower, and right in front of it was a raft through photos that I have. So straight out of Gatsby, there's the tower. I'm gonna just focus on the picture to the right. There's his boathouse complex, because as well as being a champion horseman, as well as being a champion cattle raiser, a champion farmer in general, he was a champion yachtsman. And this is his boathouse complex. And what he had here were 2 spars, where in Westport at Longshore, he could raise his ships and put them into permanent winter storage. And this was his first of 7 ever increasing yachts. Here is the Kima, his first yacht. There it is at Longshore. It had a complement of 55 sailors. It burned 4.5 tons of coal at sea a day, and it cost $1.5 million just to maintain while it sat at dock. Now, what you're seeing there is those sailors are U.S. Navy sailors, because what he did in 1917 was he gave the ship to the U.S. government for World War I, and what it did was it patrolled Battery Park, and it was a permanent gift that he gave to the U.S. government. He was a very patriotic guy, as I'm about to show you. But talk about Gatsby and his yachts. 55 sailors, yeah, I think that pretty much kind of counts towards the Gatsby-esque of himself. There he is with the hat. As I said, I'd talk about that hat. Well, that's because he's a Western rancher. And what's interesting is in Gatsby, you might remember that Jay Gatz, née Gatsby, becomes obsessed with wealth when he spends time working on Dan Cody's yacht. And at that point, he says, well, you know what, I want to be Dan Cody. And he begins to pursue that. So it's interesting to think that Lewis might also be a template for Dan Cody. Besides the Kima, those are pictured there are several of his other ships. He owned 2 of the fastest boats in America, speedboats called hydroplanes with aircraft engines. Now in Gatsby, Nick Carraway famously comments on the hydroplane when Gatsby says to him, "Hey, old sport, do you want to hop into my hydroplane and take a spin around the Sound?" Now that's right at the beginning, and that line Fitzgerald meant to use to convey the extraordinary wealth that Gatsby had by owning a speedboat. But he was also actually indicating that Gatsby was even wealthier than that, as I'm going to show you in just a little while. I told you that Lewis owned many, many ships. He owned 7 other ships. Most of them were called the Stranger. Here's one pictured in 1938 out of Los Angeles, as you know. Again, he owned that great, fantastic ranching estate in Diamond Bar, California. In 1938, he owned the largest non-governmental craft in America. Now, what does that translate into? It means that he owned the largest ships in America that weren't owned by the U.S. Navy, meaning, battleships and aircraft carriers. And in a really fun story, in 1938, when he did a South Seas journey, he did on the side some covert spying for the U.S. government. And he was spying Japanese naval and air installations in Southeast Asia on behalf of the U.S. government. And indeed, 3 years later, the Japanese would attack Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. Now, in this shot, what I love about this picture is that that is another form of a hydroplane. That's a hydro, water, plane, literally airplane. Today, as we call them, seaplanes. He owned these as well. Now, keep in mind, this picture's from 1917. The airplane itself has been just invented. The seaplane was so brand new and so highly dangerous. By the way, today, most insurance companies don't even insure seaplanes. That to own a hydroplane and to also own the boat version of a hydroplane, that combined, when people would have read that in 1925, they would have thought of one, either the boat, the other, the plane, or as Fitzgerald intended, both put together. And to convey Gatsby's immense wealth, he not only owned the fastest boats in existence at that time, he owned one of the rarest forms of aviation at that time. Now, keep in mind, the Gatsby is 50,000 perfectly sculpted and chiseled words. I mean, it can be written, I'm sorry, not written, obviously, but read in a summer's day. And I recommend everybody to just spend a day reading Gatsby. Try to pick a summer day. Well, treat yourself and read it. It's not that long, but as Mark Twain said, sorry for writing you a long letter. I didn't have time to write you a short one, meaning that to write it short means you've got to condense the meaning and it becomes a work of art. So when Fitzgerald writes that Gatsby's got a hydroplane, it's got that double meaning. And by the way, to own something like this back then would have been the equivalent of owning, like today, maybe one of Elon Musk's rockets. It bespoke wealth on a grand scale. Here's Lewis with his chauffeur at Longshore. Lewis, if we haven't seen enough of him as a great yachtsman or a great horseman, let's talk about him as a great motorist. When I did my research, I found a ton on Lewis from 1907 on. He's mentioned in some of the leading motoring journals of the time period, engaged in many, many races. I would like to tell you that he came in first. He never did. He came in third, fourth, fifth, and sixth quite a bit. But he engaged in cross-country races all throughout the United States. And he owned 3 of the most expensive cars of the time period. 2 of them, in today's money, were worth $160,000. A third one was worth $250,000 in today's money. So we are talking about a man who has done it all by land, by sea, and by air. To say he's a larger than life figure would be an understatement. But here I come to, I think, probably the greatest story of my entire story. And that is the greatest party that was ever thrown in Connecticut history. And I think, as you'll agree with me quite shortly, perhaps the greatest party. I just can't think of ones that were bigger. I mean, I guess it would take work, but this might be one of the great parties in American history. It was a World War I fundraiser. It happened right before Scott and Zelda arrived in Westport. And he threw a giant all-day party, a party that 800 cars parked at. Now, let me tell you this is 1917. 800 cars. I don't even know if there were 800 more cars in the entire state of Connecticut at that time. 800 cars is a staggering number. It also argues about the wealth of the people who were at this event. So let's break it down. To your right, you can see that the great magician and escape artist Houdini was at this. Houdini was usually pushed off a dock in a locked box and then escaped. But at the Lewis estate, it was even more dramatic. Lewis owned these large cranes that were used for picking his boats in and out of the water. And in a more dramatic fashion, he actually used the crane to lower out Houdini out into the Sound where he was dropped. That was very, very rare and even more dramatic because Houdini was in deeper water, but obviously he escaped. But number one, you've got Houdini at your party. Now, there's no bigger draw at that time, except maybe there was. Okay. If you look at the article to the left, these are all from the Westport Herald of that time period. You'll see that David Belasco was there with Ina Claire. Now, Ina Claire is the first naturalistic actress in American history. She was making $5,000 a week in that time period's money, which is staggering. She was Fitzgerald's favorite actress. He had pictures of her all over his dorm room at Princeton. He wanted her to play Nicole in Tender as the Night in the 1934 film version, and she acted in a play at this fundraiser, and David Belasco managed her. Who's David Belasco? Well, his ghost is said to haunt the Belasco Theater in New York City to this day. And if you go see a play, if you go see a musical, if you go see an opera, what David Belasco did was he invented the template for stage design to this day. There's nobody bigger. Whenever you go and see any of these sort of productions, you have to tip your hat to the originator, David Belasco. John Philip Sousa, king of the march music before the advent of jazz, he was the biggest single musical act in America, performed there. He not only performed there, but he made a song specifically for the event. Annette Kellerman herself, I love how that's written there. Who was she? Well, Annette invented the sport of synchronized swimming, but she also invented something that Zelda Fitzgerald absolutely loved and held dear to her. Annette Kellerman created the biggest revolution in women's swimwear until the bikini of 1946, which was the one-piece swimsuit. And Zelda loved Annette Kellerman's swimsuits. As a matter of fact, that's all she wore. And what she did was she would pick a color, a tan beige color, which made her appear as if she was completely nude. She did this on purpose. And I'm going to just harken back to that story I told you about, Effie Lewis kicking her out of the party, but he said, hey, Zelda, you can still swim at my house. What I love about that was I like to think that, he might have been angry at her, but he didn't mind this nubile 19-year-old, highly athletic, which Zelda was, appearing to be skinny dipping off of his house. And actually, I'll be talking about that more because they actually did skinny dip off his house, but that's a little bit later. Who else performed there? Marceline the Clown. Who was he? Well, in an era when Celine Dion does one-year stands, and Britney Spears does one-year stands in Vegas, Marceline the Clown did a 10-year run at the Hippodrome in New York City. The Hippodrome being combination, it's the greatest single entertainment venue in New York City at the time. He did 10 years there. He had his own comic strip. He didn't do it, but it was written about him called Marceline the Clown. How important is Marceline? Charlie Chaplin said, I am Marceline. Everything I do, I copy. It's Marceline. So Marceline was the template for Charlie Chaplin, the most important film actor in world history. But two more stories that kind of really, I think, put this party over the top was he decided to have a circus there too. Now in New York City in 1917, they kept all the animals in McDougal Street, down in the Village, and these were rented out to circuses, to the Metropolitan Opera, to plays, to musicals. Well, he ordered an entire animal circus for his party. Half of them were shipped by barge from New York to his estate in Westport, Longshore. The other half were taken by train, by private rail cars, and detrained by the estate. So a full animal circus. The apogee, the apex of the entire party was that all of a sudden the guests would have heard the thunder of hooves. They would have looked and to their surprise have seen a stagecoach pulled by 6 Arabian horses being frantically pursued by a group of Native Americans that were attacking it, who in turn were being frantically pursued by a group of American cowboys. They come to the rescue of this wagon train. They're led by, of course, Effie Lewis, who is dressed in white with a big white hat. And to the joy of the crowd, they're all rescued. But what makes this story even more amazing is that these were real cowboys that Lewis brought out from California. And not only that, but even more extraordinary, these were real Native Americans brought out from the West. I mean, they're just recently removed from the frontier. Absolutely extraordinary party with other things, a dog show, water sports, airplanes taking people for a lift. And remember, at that time in 1917, who had been on an airplane, much less been in a car? It was quite the treat. Okay, I'll give you a second to read these headlines in the summer of 1920 in Westport while the Fitzgeralds were there. Well, they come in the summer, the first summer of Prohibition. They come in the first summer in a town that completely ignores all the laws of Prohibition. Westport had voted by a 3-2 margin to not honor Prohibition. Connecticut and Rhode Island were the only 2 states never to ratify Prohibition. The reason for that is that both Connecticut and Rhode Island had the largest per capita group of Italian Americans at that time. And as of my last research into this 7 years ago, they still do to this day. And one of the reasons that Prohibition was ignored then was that you were not going to take away the sacrament, the use of wine in the sacrament in the Catholic rituals, and indeed the great tradition of growing your own wine, which was very popular in Westport. The police department had exactly 4 members to it. It was a mixture of Italian Americans and Irish Americans. I can say this because I'm Irish. The Irish had no interest in upholding Prohibition. So they lived in a town that looked the other way. And I'll just take a couple of these headlines to show you the extent of it. When you look at that $17,000 worth of booze being held up, that's $250,000 in today's money. And in that lower left-hand corner where they talk about the taxi overturning and the booze coming out, one of my favorite stories, because the booze was in the fenders, the booze was in the wheel wells, the booze was in the seats, the booze was in the headlamps. They actually didn't work. They were full of booze. So they lived in a town that was notoriously dismissive of prohibition, and this shows up in Gatsby too. I'll talk about that in just a second. I'll give you a second to read that little article on the left and to take a look at that ad on the right, and then I'll talk about it. Okay, the Miramar Inn was one of the countless speakeasies in Westport at that time, as I talked about in the PBS documentary, Connecticut Goes Drive-By Prohibition. I made the point to say that if it was a restaurant in the time period of Prohibition, it was a speakeasy, and that's a pretty generally good rule to follow. The Miramar was the most important speakeasy between New York and Boston. At the time, George Raft, Jimmy Cagney, and Humphrey Bogart were big fans of it. As you can tell by the article on the left, Scott and Zelda were on the way to the Miramar. Guaranteed they had already been drinking before they even got in the car on the way to the Miramar. What's important to our Gatsby story here is that you'll notice that Fitzgerald loses a wheel, and he recycled this in Gatsby. You might remember that in one of Gatsby's parties, what does one of the guests do when leaving the party? He loses his wheel. So what Scott's doing is he's just recycling that, his own experience, and putting it into Great Gatsby. Again, Scott following his adage that all his characters are F. Scott Fitzgerald. So great, another great Westport scene and action that shows up in Gatsby. Okay, on the left is the Campo Inn. That was another fabulously fun and popular speakeasy. Down that steep hill, we've got two eyewitness accounts of Zelda flying down that hill, hanging on to the hood ornament of a taxi cab. One of those retellings, she's completely naked on top of that hood of that, taxi cab. You can pick whatever version you enjoy, but we definitely have that corroborated that she partied there and was engaged in some sort of automotive stunt. But I want to draw your attention to the guy on the right. That's Bald Jack Rose. He was so popular at the time, they named a drink after him called the, not surprisingly, Bald Jack Rose. He had alopecia, so he was completely hairless, hence his name. But why do we care? Bald Jack Rose was a underworld figure from Norwalk, neighboring Norwalk, Connecticut, right next door to Westport. But what he did was he began to run a bunch of speakeasies and gambling houses in New York City as well. He was the brother-in-law of Jake Levy, who owned the Campo Inn that Scott and Zelda spent time at. He also controlled all the booze in Fairfield County, Connecticut. And he's a direct link to Meyer Wolfsheim in the novel. And how do we know that? Well, simply put, you might remember in Gatsby that Meyer Wolfsheim talks about the murder of Rosie Rosenthal at the Metropole in New York City. And indeed, Jack Rose himself was an eyewitness that turned state's evidence to that actual crime. So again, here we see a bootlegger that controls bootlegging in Westport that actually is a witness to the murder that Meyer Wolfsheim talks about in The Great Gatsby. So now we see another thing from The Great Gatsby with the Westport influence showing up, and that's Jack Rose. I'll give you a second to just absorb these fun headlines. Okay, what they came into again was a wild, raucous, roaring, partying town that was completely ignoring federal law. And not only that, they were engaged in things like this: nude bathing and midnight orgies. Indeed, Scott Goodfriend, Edmund Wilson, the great literary critic, wrote of Scott and Zelda that they were engaged in the nude orgies of Westport. Now, was this helped by the fact that Zelda might have been wearing that Annette Kellerman one-piece beige tan colored swimsuit that made her look naked? Perhaps. But in general, it appears that they actually were engaged in some skinny dipping, at least. So again, that summer when she's 19 and he's 24, it's pretty all over the top on how they behaved. And I just wanted to show you this. This is the real estate brochure of F.E. Lewis when he sold the house. Lewis got divorced. He was married 4 times, the last time to the 18-year-old daughter of his college roommate, which must have caused some eyebrows to raise. But it just shows you the eloquence of this grand estate with its 6 bathrooms, fireproof stables, formal gardens, and 1 mile of waterfront directly on the Sound. A beautiful estate, still a beautiful estate. It's the #1 now as a public golf course, restaurant, and hotel. It's the #1 wedding destination in Connecticut, and it's the 9th most popular golf course in Connecticut. So again, the great, what F.E. Lewis did was he sold this. He ended up selling Diamond Bar, California, and he moved to Vancouver, and where he bought an island called Coal Island, where he lived the rest of his days avoiding American taxes and on a giant estate on this island. Again, multiple ships and a place with its own gas pumps, a completely self-sufficient sort of home. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to transition right now to a film clip. Okay. I'm going to make sure that, again, just let me know if you should be, let me make sure real quickly. I'm going to share this. Okay. Okay, share computer sounds good. So you should see this. So what I'm going to show you is a quick 3-minute clip from our documentary. It's called Gatsby in Connecticut, not surprisingly. Just to try to hopefully get you excited about the clip you're about to see. The New Yorker came out with the top 36 films of 2020. Okay, and I'm talking about all the films made in America in 2020, top 36 films of 2020. and this one came in at number 30. So we're very proud of that. So I'm just going to show you a quick 3-minute clip. It'll give you a sense of our documentary, which you can rent. I think most popularly, people like to see it on Amazon Prime. So let me show you a clip.
Who was Jay Gatsby modeled on?
I find it interesting that so many people are digging into who were the sources for Gatsby. There have been some specific names proposed, and then there have been other theories, so we may never know.
I heard he was in oil from a man who knew all about him, grew up with him in Texas.
I knew somebody who grew up with him in St. Paul.
Well, you look at him sometimes when he doesn't know anyone's looking at him. You can see it in his eyes. I bet he did kill a man.
Which one is he?
Yes, there is something ultimately about Gatsby that we never quite know.
You're not supposed to be able to grasp it.
Right,
Yeah.
his essence, yeah.
But I don't think there's any one person who served as a model for Gatsby.
He took his experience, of course, as you're saying, it all comes from your own experience, but he blends different times of his life, different people he knew with himself, and creates composites. In fact, Hemingway wrote him a famous letter criticizing him for that. You should base one character on one person, like I do. Like
Really?
Hemingway does, yeah.
You could have the ambition and the pretense that you would be able to see so thoroughly into another person's character that no part of you
Right.
would show up in the description.
And
I'm not sure I believe
No,
that.
I don't either. And I think Fitzgerald wrote him back and rejected.
It all converges on Gatsby, and Gatsby is inexhaustible.
All those people who claim to have a piece of Scott's original raw material in their community, they might have a partial truth.
Everyone's colored by their own prejudice of where they grew up. So when we interview people from Long Island, they're all convinced Gatsby's from Long Island.
The danger of writing a book about Gatsby is that you then hear from all these people all over the world who've got the key.
We're not supposed to read Gatsby and think Westport. That wasn't Fitzgerald's intention. He wanted us to read Gatsby and think Long Island. But since he didn't have those experiences on Long Island, since they came out of his magic year of 1920 on Westport, where he had a beach, he had a cottage next to a mysterious recluse, that's what he's using as his model.
I think the interesting thing about all of these speculations and surmises and everything is that it's great if it enlivens the book. It's awful if it weighs it down.
Mm-hmm.
My father was on the scene when we started to lose our way during Gatsby's time, and he recorded it all. The generosity, the greed, the innocence, and the cynicism, the magnificence and the waste that was America between the two world wars. People read him now for clues and guidelines, as if by understanding him and his beautiful and damn period, they could see more clearly what's wrong.
The thing that jumps out for me is she also puts in and his beautiful and damn period, which is
I can see that puts it right in your movie.
Yeah.
Okay, so some of you might recognize.
Who was Jay Gatsby modeled on?
You might recognize Sam Waterston, who's become a dear friend that has been part of our film. Again, you can rent it on Amazon, and I'll just leave you with this last image. Again, this is my book. It's been a labor of love for over 42 years. It's been quite popular. It's a limited edition. It's a truly limited edition because in order to show some of the images that the Fitzgerald estate allowed me to show, I promised them I would only be able to produce 1,500 copies. You'll see images in this book you'll never see anywhere else again, and you've never seen before, and you'll never see anywhere else again, because it is literally that limited of a run. I'm very proud of that, and I want to thank you for joining me. I'm going to stop the share. I'm going to become a talking head again. It's lovely. Jessica, thank you for posting all of this information. You were very, very, very sweet to do that. And I just see a comment from Jackie Bruckner. Wilton was dry in the 70s and 80s, where you grew up. Yeah, Jackie, it was. And what all those kids did from Wilton and Weston was they came down to Westport and they drank. And they tended to drink a little too much along with all the other Westporters that drank too much. And we ended up having little, well, tete-a-tetes, let's put it to you that way. So Jessica, great. If it doesn't look like there's any questions, and if there is, now's the time to ask. And if there's not, I'll be happy to sign off. But Jessica, thanks a million for this. I really appreciate it again. I just thought it was, I don't know, I was really looking forward to tonight and doing this for Santa Fe, a place that looms large in my imagination. It's just, you know, it's so romantic, really. So I gotta come and find out for myself and do my first visit to the Great American Desert.
You will have to visit us in the land of enchantment as soon as you can. Thank you so much. I know our readers and myself, we were fascinated by Gatsby, Fitzgerald, Zelda. Very interesting. Loved all the articles you had there. It really paints a picture of what it was like. Looks like Douglas asked, that's beautiful book cover.
Yeah, no, Douglas, yeah, good call. No, we do not, but I can tell you what it was made for. It was for a Detroit motoring magazine. Fitzgerald couldn't sell that story, The Cruise of the Rolling Junk, but it was for a Detroit motoring magazine. What is interesting enough is that very few people have ever read that story. And what's great about that story is that it is America's first road story. And it's funny. It is drop dead funny. So if there's two things that I would like Fitzgerald fans to try to think about doing, Jessica, is to read The Beautiful and Damned and to read The Cruise of the Rolling Junk. They're two glorious pieces of Fitzgeraldonia that are rarely explored. So, Jessica, I owe you guys a lot. I really, really appreciate it. You've been so wonderful for allowing me to do this. I wish you the very best in these trying times. I'll leave you with this. Again, I started by saying how in 1920, there were those three great challenges: race riots, and a pandemic, and a depression. Well, remember what happened just after that? It was called the Roaring '20s. And what's going to happen after all of this? Already the technological explosion is happening just like it did in the 1920s. We are heading towards the Roaring 2020s. So buckle up, people, because it's going to be a good and fun ride. Thanks a million, Jessica. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for being with us this evening. Definitely check out Boats Against the Current and the film Gatsby in Connecticut. I put the links there in the chat box for you, but you can just Google search Boats Against the Current, Richard Webb. You'll find everything there online to find